Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Tampa Bay History Center and to Florida Conversations. This is a free and accessible event for the public, both in person and streamed live on Zoom, and we are absolutely delighted to have you with us here in person today and virtually. First, we would like to extend our thanks to our generous sponsors for making this program possible. That's USF Libraries, WUSF Public Media, and AARP Tampa Bay. Additional sponsor support is graciously provided to us by Shelley Blood and the Lorenzo Malay family. Please note that a full-length recording of today's program will be available on the History Center's YouTube channel after the program concludes. For our audience here in Tico Hall, we remind you that if you have any questions at the end of the program, we will bring a microphone to you during the Q&A portion of today's program. And for our audience on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature on the Zoom webinar app to submit your questions during today's presentation. To introduce our speaker today, I would like to introduce the communications manager from Florida Humanities. Please welcome Andrew Quintana for me.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is this on? Yeah. Hi, I'm Andrew Quintana, Communications Manager for Florida Humanities. And this series, first of all, would not be possible without the generous support of our partners like Tampa Bay History Center. So if you guys could just join me in a round of applause, thanking them for helping us put this together. So Florida Humanities is the statewide nonprofit affiliate for the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are dedicated to preserving and sharing the stories, cultures, and histories that define our state. For more than 5 decades, we have worked to inspire communities through engaging programs like this one, grant funding, and partnerships that bring Florida's diverse heritage to life. If you want to learn more about Florida Humanities, our organization, you can go visit our table in the back with our wonderful colleagues, Mara Utterback and Miriam, and, or you can visit our website at floridahumanities.org. This year, our Center for the Book series, this is our 3rd program in that series, focuses on literature that illuminates Florida's unique natural landscapes and the challenges of preserving them. It's in that spirit that we are thrilled to showcase Tracing Florida Journeys, Explorers, Travelers, and Landscapes, then and now by Dr. Leslie Kemp Poole. Tracing Florida Journeys features well-known explorers and voyagers who traveled through Florida and wrote about their experiences. Highlighting the Florida that was and the Florida that exists now, Dr. Poole tells a revealing story about the state's natural histories and changing human perceptions of it in hopes of enlightening audiences and inspiring them to take their own journey. Dr. Poole is a 4th-generation Floridian and an associate professor of environmental studies at Rollins College. She is the author of Saving Florida, Women's Fight for the Environment in the 20th Century, and the co-editor of The Wilder Heart of Florida, More Riders, Inspired by Florida Nature. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Poole.
Hello, everybody. So nice to be here. I want to thank the History Center for having me, and Amanda with all your help, Andrew and group with the Florida Humanities Council. They have been a wonderful partner with me on this book, and it's and publicity, and so it's been really fun. I have deep roots in Florida. As he mentioned, I'm a 4th-generation Floridian, but I'm also a 3rd-generation Tampan. Is that how we say it? What we say it? Yeah. And my son lives here now, so it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to have a shout out, if you don't mind. I got some high school friends here today. Plant High School. And also Bruce Hunt, who was the photographer for most of the pictures you're going to see in this, went to high school with me, and he's sitting here in the back. And I appreciate him letting me use his images as well, because I could talk to you, but I'd rather show you. So this book is the culmination of my total nerdiness in Florida history and Florida literature. There's nothing I like better than to read a Florida author and then try to go find the places that they have written about. And so this is a project that includes all of that. And what I have done is I have incorporated the stories in 11 different places in Florida. The main requirement was that it had to follow a journey or travels that had been written extensively about by a person who came through Florida. And there were many people who came through Florida and wrote about it, but not all of them wrote long pieces, and we also tried to locate it geographically around the state as well. So let's see. There we go. So this is the book that I'm going, and now what I want to do is, since I can't tell you the whole book, is take you on a journey around the state with me, and I'll talk about some of the interesting people who came through Florida and how their experiences were changed or reflect their culture and their expectations of the state as well. So we have to begin with Hernando de Soto, right? We're in Tampa. 1539, Hernando and expedition unload maybe up to 750 people onto the shores of Tampa Bay looking for glory. And Hernando was not here to take a look at Florida springs or rivers. He was here to find riches and to claim land, which he had been active in other expeditions in Central and South America as well. But he is an interesting figure in that lots of places in Florida like to claim him. So in researching De Soto, I found there were so many things we do know and that we don't know about him. Interestingly, there are 4 accounts of his expedition, 3 that was written by people who were actually on the trip, which makes for a really fascinating reading, and you can see what all of their wants and desires are along the way. One of the big debates is, where did he land? Everybody wants to claim this, and there have been entire books written about this and commissions that were held to try to figure it out. And we now think probably the most likely point where he landed was at Piney Point down in the southeastern part of Tampa Bay. This is what it looks like today. You can barely see like the St. Pete skyline from there, and it's gotten famous in recent years because there's a gypsum stack there that had a big leak, you may remember, which I don't think Hernando and group would have ever imagined. Instead, what they thought about was unloading their horses onto the shore and their huge core of people and finding food and finding treasure, and that meant engaging with the local people. There is a community near there he described as having 7 Indian mounds that now is kind of a marina, but it's the best guess is where he went. And the problem is we don't really know where he went. First of all, we didn't have modern navigation, right? And Florida changes with storms, right? And rivers and erosion. But this is the best guess map of where they set out from Tampa Bay, moving north, always looking for riches, but they had scouting parties that wandered around too looking. And at some point probably crossed the Withlacoochee River. We know they crossed the Swanee. And really the only place we know that they landed was Tallahassee. On the left is a picture of a landing at Withlacoochee River that we think is the best guess of where they would have had to cross with all of their people and their armor and their horses and their entourage, but it doesn't quite look that way now. In the middle is the lone marker in Tallahassee, which is the only known place where we know the De Soto expedition stayed. And we know this because of an accidental archaeological dig that happened in the area. The state was building a state office building, and the state archaeologist came down and took a look at it and started digging around and discovered chainmail and other artifacts that proved that that was where the De Soto expedition actually spent their winter. Now it's kind of a sad little marker with lichen on it, but it's the place. De Soto spent the winter here, looted a lot of food that the local natives had grown, and then they convinced him that gold was north. Keep going north, and that's what he did. That was kind of, so De Soto wasn't really here to look at Florida. For him and for his expedition members, Florida was dangerous. The natives were not friendly. The swamps were hard to get through. There was no moment of finding beauty. And the same goes for Jonathan Dickinson. Sorry, so Jonathan Dickinson is a Quaker during the colonial period in America, and he traveled from Jamaica, headed back to Philadelphia where his family lived, and ends up in a huge storm where his ship wrecks off the coast of what's now Hobe Sound, the Jupiter area as well. He knew right away that he was in trouble because the local natives that were totally unfamiliar to him, but they had aligned with the Spanish who were headquartered in St. Augustine. And so they recognized that if they admitted that they were Englishmen, that they would be endangered. So they had one crew member who spoke a little Spanish and who helped them pretend that they were actually Spanish. The native people were really interesting. Dickinson saw them as very dangerous, as very savage, as very uncivilized, and yet they brought them into their villages. They fed them food. The women suckled his child. He was traveling with a wife and a young child, and when her milk ran out, the native women actually fed the child. But he didn't see this necessarily as friendly at all. And they end up taking a trip where they hike all the way up the Atlantic coast to St. Augustine. They hike, and they also take some boats up the what's now the intercoastal. It's a really fascinating story. And today you can go back and you can see a large native mound at this site in Jupiter, which is also the site of a really famous lighthouse that was not there. And that's probably one of the few places that you can be sure that Dickinson and his party visited. They do end up getting to St. Augustine. Again, here's some of the pictures of what the beach looks like, which looks great, right? I'll just walk up the beach, but if you know anything about that Atlantic beach, it can be really deep sand, it can be very rocky, and it can also be very slanted, so it's not easy to walk on. And we know at least several members of their party died from exposure, sleeping on the beach as well. When Dickinson got back to Philadelphia, he wrote a whole book about it. He attributed their survival to God's grace, and it was a very popular read during this period of time. He went on to become the mayor of Philadelphia. He had a great wealth and continued on and had more children as well. But a different kind of Quaker from Philadelphia came to Florida in the 1770s. William Bartram. I like to call him Billy. That's what his dad called him. Billy's dad, John Bartram, had been the botanist for the King of England at a period of time, again the colonial period, where it was considered totally cool to have plants from the New World in your personal arboretum. So he had been on collecting trips with his father. And although his father tried to encourage him in many different businesses, they all failed. But one thing that we know about Billy is he loved the outdoors and he loved to draw. And so he, in 1774, manages to get another wealthy collector in England to sponsor him to take a trip through the southeastern United States. He comes to Florida in 1773, 1774. He may have been trying to avoid whatever was brewing with the Patriots and the oncoming Revolutionary War, but he finds nirvana. So here's a Quaker who doesn't see Florida as threatening. He sees it as something beautiful, as something made by God, as something kind of in a romantic point of view. This is one of the plants that he drew, his Franklinia. He named it for Benjamin Franklin, who was a family friend. And this is a marker too. There's a William Bartram trail that you can find throughout the southeastern United States that document where he traveled. I'm not the only big Bartram fan. He goes home, and 10 years after his trek, again, he goes all the way through what is now the Carolinas, Alabama, Louisiana. When he goes home 10 years later, he writes a book of his accounts, using his journals, using the information he had gathered, and it's got, as you can see, a very long title, but we just kind of refer to it as Bartram's Travels. And it's really a remarkable book. It's beautiful to read. It's a flowery language of his time period. And for some people and scientists, they thought that he was a little too flowery and romantic, that he didn't get things right. But over time, we've learned that actually Bartram was a very capable, although self-trained, naturalist, and that he had a good eye, especially for plants. He was on the St. Johns River, and with his father, he got to around New Smyrna Beach. At the other times, he got probably down toward Volusia County, for sure. He was in Volusia County. Yes, so he was, because the only travel then was either along the Atlantic coast by boat or inland. You had to come by boat. And so he's on a little tiny dugout canoe, probably a little bark with a sail on it, and he's traveling most of the time by himself up and down the St. Johns River. And he has there's two stores where he takes his collections and keeps them for shipment back to England as well. It's a fascinating story. He does join other people along the way periodically, but he kind of jumbles up all of the journals to make it look like it's just one narrative, one trip. Again, it inspired British poets, especially his description of Florida Springs, where he talks about the diaphanous, clear water where all the animals and fish seem to all get along. It's really beautiful. And his book was a huge hit in England. It was interesting in the States, but in England, it was a real hit, and a lot of writers copied or mimicked some of his descriptions and used it as inspiration. We now know he saw more than 600 species that he described, including the Franklinia, which I showed you a drawing of earlier, but also the Ixia, which I love this story. He saw this plant, described it, and it wasn't seen again until the 1930s. And so a lot of botanists and scientists said, oh, he just made that up. And then when it was rediscovered, they were like, oh yeah, he got it right. So we see a lot of changing attitudes about him, and now it's actually being sold commercially. And I met a lady up in the Jacksonville area who has it growing in her yard. So that's one of the interesting things. He just seemed to be in the right place at the right time. One of my favorite accounts of his is when he travels with a group of traders to Payne's Prairie. Have any of you been to Payne's Prairie? Yeah, it's in between Gainesville and Ocala. It's a really fascinating area. Bartram was there, and he, with some traders again who were there, and he got to visit the prairie, and he got to meet a Seminole chief. The chief's name was Ahia, and he decided to name Bartram, and he called him Puck Puggy, which meant flower gatherer or flower hunter. And there's a lot of people who believe that by gaining this chief's trust, I mean, he smoked a peace pipe, he maybe was given safe passage through the area, that no one messed with him. I mean, he wasn't in any way threatening to these people as well, and he was very, very curious. Interesting, on Payne's Prairie, when Bartram saw wolves crossing the prairie, and it had, at one point, the Seminoles had cattle and horses on the prairie as well. When the prairie became a state park, which it is today, the land managers went back to read Bartram to figure out what the prairie should look like, because he had the best descriptions of it. On the bottom, if you ever read, one of the most famous passages from Bartram is where he spends the night on an island, probably Idlewild Point in the right-hand side in the St. Johns River, and he has interesting encounters with the alligators. He says they attacked his boat, they tried to grab his fish, he was fishing at night for food, and then he saw them all line up together across the river to eat oncoming fish that were traveling. Again, this was poo-pooed for a very long time, partly because his drawing looks more like a dragon than an alligator, right? But now we know that there are crocodilian cooperative eating behaviors that he was actually describing. So it was really interesting. As much as he was afraid of alligators, the next day he went out and investigated an alligator nest at length and wrote about it, and we know that's probably more dangerous than anything, is messing with an active nest in Florida. John James Audubon had read Bartram, and he was inspired by Bartram. And when he got to the St. Johns River in 1831, he took a look around and said, yeah, this is not what I was expecting. He said, Mr. Bartram has all these flowery sayings, but I'm not seeing this in the St. Johns River. But Audubon had different motivations. What was he looking for? Birds, and he was looking for new birds because he was selling subscriptions to his big elephant folios where he would do life-size prints of birds that he had discovered along the way, and he needed some new birds, and he was not finding them in the St. Johns River. He didn't find his nirvana until he reached the Florida Keys. Again, St. John's is a bust, but the Keys are fabulous. And here he finds all of these water birds, who some of them are in full plumage when he's there, and to collect for his drawings. Now, we think of Audubon as someone who loves birds, right? Who would never kill a bird. But in fact, Audubon killed hundreds of birds on this trip. And here's why. There were no telescopes, there's no long-range lenses for a camera, so he would go in and shoot birds, find the one that looked the best, and then they would put wires within the bird's body to pose it, and from that he would draw. And sometimes he ate them, you know, and he brought along an artist with him to draw the backdrops of his bird paintings, which is really, that's sometimes really fascinating too, is to look at the backdrops of them. His real nirvana was in the Keys, particularly in the dry Tortugas, where he saw thousands of different birds nesting on the islands there, and fascinatingly enough, you can still see them. If you go to the Audubon House down in Key West, where he never stayed, but they took his name. You can see some of the prints there. If you're interested right now, the Daytona Beach Museum of Arts and Science has a huge Audubon exhibition going on where you can see prints of all of the birds that he saw in Florida. It's really fabulous. And this just gives you an idea of how large the prints were. He had to kind of fold down the flamingo's head to make it fit onto the page as well. Yes. No, the artist came along with him to paint the backgrounds, so he would see them. So wait a minute, let me see. Let me go back. If you see in the back of the roseate spoonbill, see how elaborate that landscape looks? But there unfortunately seems to be a mountain too. So some of these may not have gotten finished till they got back to England. So some of them are a little bit questionable, but there's a couple of birds that have, like the fort in St. Augustine is in the background of one of them, and it becomes very interesting. So this is a trip that I took with Bruce to go down to the Keys, and we met Jerry and Linda Lawrence. Jerry is the head ornithologist for the Florida Audubon Society. It's now called Audubon Florida. And he has done a lot of studies of roseate spoonbills. He's really concerned and excited about the return of flamingos to Florida, and he's been working on some protection measures for that. And you can see the pictures. We saw the terns, and that doesn't do any justice to the number of terns that we saw. They're still nesting in the Tortugas. We took the seaplane over. It was really fascinating to see all this landscape and think about Audubon being there and what he saw from the shoreline. John Muir. John Muir, we think of him as John Muir of the Sierra Club, right? The Sierra Mountains. Well, long before he went there, he came through Florida. And he did it much like Bartram as a botanist. He came looking at plants in the southeast. And what happened is that he had been working in a factory up north, and he had had an accident in which a file slipped and caused him to be blind in one eye. His other eye also went blind in sympathetic blindness, and while he was lying in a dark room, which was kind of the only cure they had, he made a deal with God. If I get healed, I'm going to finally take these large trips, this big adventure that I want to take, and I'm going to walk to Florida from Indiana, and that's exactly what he did when he healed. So he takes a trip. He writes about it in a book called 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf. I highly recommend it if you haven't taken a look at it. He keeps journals. He's collecting botanical specimens. He has very little equipment with him. At one point, and I think it's in 1867. This is 2 years after the Civil War. So you can also read this book as a description of the post-war South. And it's pretty barren, according to what he had to say. He also encountered guerrillas along the roadside, a couple who tried to rob him and then realized he had nothing that they wanted of theirs. But here's an example of his journal where he would write in his journals and also do drawings, and he was fascinated by Florida palm trees. You can look at these online at the Sierra Club online. You can look at all of his journals. They were published posthumously, so it was never published in his lifetime, but it tells the story of a young man. And if you look at the opening title here, it says, John Muir, Earth, Planet, Universe. Okay, so this is not your normal traveler, right? And as he wanders through Florida in particular, he's really starting to form his philosophy about the human place in the world. When he lands in Fernandina, he walks all the way to Savannah, where he waits days and days and sleeps in the Savannah Cemetery, waiting for money to come. Once the money comes, he gets on a boat to Fernandina, lands in Fernandina, buys a loaf of bread, takes off walking along the rail lines, because that was the safest way and easiest way to travel in backwoods Florida, and he sits down and takes a nap. And he thinks to us and says, I am now in the hot gardens of the sun. This is all he had waited for. He takes a nap, and all of a sudden he hears a noise, a loud noise. And what does he think it is? Alligator, which he's kind of wanting to see, but he's scared of them, and it turns out to be a big white bird. And he's kind of embarrassed, but he admits, I got that wrong. But along the way in Florida, he really becomes entranced by he loves Spanish moss. He loves magnolia trees. He just finds so many fascinating things to look at, and he begins to think, I think in a kind of Bartram-y kind of way, that these are all God's creatures. And why should we think that we are more important than any other creature on earth? And perhaps, we all have a place here, which is moving him into kind of this transcendental thinking about spirit and nature and place. And for Muir, really, he saw God in nature. That was his chapel. These are some of my pictures from my modern day revisiting. In this book, I recall what these authors had to say, and then I've gone back to revisit where they were. On the top left is Merrill Clark, who lives in Gainesville and who is dressed here as John Muir. And he does talks in Gainesville and has actually been walking part of the trail as well, which is hard to follow now because the rail lines changed, so it's mostly roads now you have to follow. And the top middle is a group of my buddies, some of them are here today, when we walked part of what had been the rail line into Gainesville, that's now a Rails to Trails hiking path. So we all walked that together. And you can see us walking on that path. And this is Bruce and me in Cedar Key, which is the final stop for John Muir. And I took my students, you can see the middle picture, there last spring so that they could stand there, and we imagined this is the path where the rail line, he would have walked over this into Cedar Key. The interesting thing about Cedar Key is we think about great sunsets, great seafood, right? But for John Muir, it was a dangerous place because when he got there, he came down with malaria and almost died. And he had been working briefly at a sawmill, and the sawmill owner's wife took him in and nursed him back to health. If he had died there, we would never have had the John Muir that we know of today. So it's really important that he got better. He was going to go from there to South America and realized that maybe malaria, he wasn't over it, maybe that's a bad idea. So he eventually gets on a boat to New York, and from there gets a boat to California, and then becomes the John Muir of the Sierra Mountains as well. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? The little lady who started the Civil War, some people like to say. Well, after the war was over, Stowe came down to Florida and to the Mandarin area just south of Jacksonville and bought a winter home. Her husband Calvin was not in good health, and she thought that rather than staying in Connecticut where their main home was, they would come down to Florida in the winter. So she's a snowbird, right? One of the original ones. And and this is a picture of the whole family sitting on the porch of their house that overlooked the St. Johns River. And she became kind of a local celebrity. Tour boats would pull up and they'd wave to her. People got off the boat, cut branches off of her orange trees to say they'd been there. I know, but what she becomes fascinated with is one of the main modes of transportation during this period of time, which was steamboats. If you wanted to go up and down the St. Johns River, unless you're Bartram in a little boat, you usually took a steamboat, and it was also a big tourist attraction. And so she takes a trip from her home over to Palatka and down the Ocklawaha River, and she calls it a path to fairyland. She's been in fairyland, and it's an overnight trip. These were very narrow wooden boats. The Ocklawaha is still part of it, a very serpentine river, jungly, and just really fascinating, and the ultimate destination was Silver Springs, which is the first big tourist attraction in Florida. And nobody had ever seen anything like this elsewhere in the United States. So it attracted a lot of travelers. She spent the night on the boat. When they got out, they took small boats and paddled around and looked at the springs. And you can see there's an old picture of a steamboat coming into the springs, and now today you can take the glass bottom boats, right? Let's see. There we go. Today you can still go on the Ocklawaha River on part of it, but you can't make the whole trip to Silver Springs anymore from the St. Johns River because it was dammed in the 1960s as part of the Cross Florida Barge Canal project. The dam has actually outlived its lifetime. It's still there, and there are efforts to remove the dam and restore this Ocklawaha section as well. Karen Chadwick is one of the people who is trying to get the dam removed, and she took us out on the river and looked at the old section of the Ocklawaha on a January day, and it still feels very, very wild and just beautiful. And you could imagine Stowe standing on the river, the boat deck, and admiring it. In West Florida, I didn't really find one author who had done a lot of travelogues, but I found a number of authors who had been there and written about it. Andrew Jackson and his wife Rachel were there when he was territorial governor, and she first thought Pensacola really was awful, and then eventually decided that it was pretty nice. It's really funny to read her different accounts of it as well. Who knew Daniel Boone bought property in the Panhandle for a while, tried to talk his family into moving down, and his wife said no, so he ended up selling it, but he came through looking at it. I mean, Florida was really wilderness for many people in this period of time as well. And you can see, because there's a photo of downtown Pensacola. Yeah. Sidney Lanier, who's a famous author who also wrote about the Ocklawaha River. He was a poet from Georgia. He wrote a big travel log about traveling through West Florida. He describes Wakulla Springs, it's beautiful, Tallahassee. And George Catlin, who was a famous painter who painted a lot of the native Indian chiefs in the United States, painted this scene of Seminole Indians on the beach in Santa Rosa Island, which I think is really beautiful. And who knew Laura Ingalls Wilder came down too? Yes, sir.
Just a point about Sidney Lanier. He stayed at the Orange Grove Hotel in downtown Tampa.
Oh, did he? In Tampa?
Right around Twiggs and Morgan.
Okay.
And he wrote a poem called Tampa Robins.
Okay.
The bird, the robin. So if you want to read that.
I will. That's very cool. A lot of the places where he stayed no longer exist. I mean, he wrote a lovely travelogue for Tallahassee, but he was writing it for the railroad company. So he was writing, PR. Nobody says bad things, right, when you're getting paid. Laura Ingalls Wilder of Little House on the Prairie fame. Her husband, Almanzo, was not well, and she thought maybe moving to Florida would be a way to restore his health. They only lasted about 9 months in Westville, which is up near the Alabama border. And I dragged my friend Mary Lou, who's in the back, down to go see it. All we could really find was the marker for it. But her daughter wrote a really eerie, strange short story about a family that stays in this area, and it makes you think they did not have a good relationship with their relatives when they left. Another huge expedition that is just so typical of the time is the Ingraham expedition. This was a whole project that was put together by James Ingraham, who was working for the plant train line at the time. And they had this great idea. Let's do an expedition from Fort Myers to Miami, and we're going to take surveyors, and we're going to survey a straight line across the Everglades, either for telegraph lines or for a possible rail line. What could possibly go wrong? Well, first of all, you can't go straight across the Everglades. I mean, and they really had not done a lot of research. They had not talked to any native people. And they set off with these big boats, and they're just, gung-ho. This is the Wild West. This is wilderness. This is a great expedition. Several members of the expedition wrote about it, and I wanted to tell you one that was written by Alonzo Church, who was 21 at the time, who tried to explain it. He said the Everglades held that idea that glamour and unexplored regions shroud themselves, and in which to an ardent fancy have all the attractions that the imagination can bring forth. The opportunity of joining an expedition for exploring this region was therefore eagerly embraced, despite the advice of friends who had been upon the border of this country and the wishes of relatives that I should not run the risks of such an undertaking. But this is like exploring darkest Africa to them at the time. Of course, it goes totally wrong. They only had enough provisions for a couple of weeks. They run out of food right away. The boats can't traverse the Everglades, especially when they get into thick sawgrass. The men end up getting out of the boats, pushing them. They quit surveying. They're pushing them and walking in muck and sawgrass. If any of you are familiar with that, sawgrass is a very well-named plant that will just rip your skin and your clothes. There were a couple of accounts where they said if we hadn't stepped on turtles today, we would not have had dinner. And they camped on any kind of rise islands, and ultimately they ran into a Seminole man who gave them directions to Miami. So they were thrilled when they finally got to Miami. Well, so when they finally got to Miami, it was like, yay, but the whole expedition in a large sense was really a bust, right? They had not accomplished what they came out to do. Today you can try to follow this, but you really can't get out in the middle of the Everglades unless you're in an airboat. We tried following what might have been their path. And in downtown Miami, you can still see the site of the old Fort Dallas that was there, and the home that was of Julia Tuttle, who the apocryphal legend is that she sent orange blossoms to Henry Flagler because after the big freezes in the 1890s, it did not freeze in Miami. I've had multiple people tell me that's probably not true, but it's the story that everybody seems to think is true. And now she's been memorialized in some of the sculpture in downtown Miami. So really, we don't really know where they went, but it was just this idea that we are going to do, this is something we're going to do, and it's going to be great, and just clearly turned out not to be. Stephen Crane, the author of The Red Badge of Courage, had caught a lot of flack after he wrote this book about the Civil War because he had never been in battle. So he decides he needs to prove himself and comes down to Jacksonville, Florida, during the time when there's a Cuban revolution with Spain that's brewing, and he decides he's going to get on a steamship that's hauling illegal weapons down to Miami, and he's going to be a war journalist, and he's going to write all about it. And while he's waylaid in Jacksonville for a while, he meets Cora Crane, who ends up becoming his wife eventually. She ran a rather interesting hotel in downtown Jacksonville where there was a lot of illegal activities going on, probably, but that was not unusual for the era. Once Crane finally gets on the boat, they leave in January 1897. It's called the Commodore. Twice before it ever gets out of the St. Johns River, it runs aground. Bad sign, because once it got into the open Atlantic, it started taking on water and ultimately sinks off the coast of Volusia County. And we know this because he wrote a long account of this called The Open Boat, which you can read online. It's a really fascinating story, and it's his story, really, of surviving the shipwreck. Hemingway said it was one of the most perfect short stories ever written. In it, he talks about how the crew is getting into lifeboats, and he ends up in the last little wooden boat with the captain, who's got a broken arm, and two other shipmates, and they follow the light from the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse and row. They take turns rowing. And the lighthouse is still there, but it's a long and arduous journey and scary and dangerous, and it's really fascinating. The headlines across the country said the day afterwards that Stephen Crane dies in shipwreck, and which alarmed Cora, but they found out once he got on land, he telegraphed her to let her know that he was okay. Today, you can still go to visit the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse, and my friend Elizabeth Friedman, years ago, used to teach these Crane in her classes. She's an English professor, and she's also a scuba diver. So she got fascinated in the idea of this wreck and joined with some others, and they went out and they finally found the wreck of the Commodore. So today, if you go to the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse, they have a small museum at the bottom that has some of the artifacts from the shipwreck. It's really a fascinating story. From here, Cora and Stephen join up. They go to Europe to be war correspondents. They're not horribly successful, and he dies not long after from tuberculosis. But it's a fascinating story, and it was really fun to follow. Zora Neale Hurston, I'm a huge fan of hers, really widely recognized now as one of the best African-American authors that we've ever had. She is in Florida because she grew up here. She claimed that she was from Eatonville, Florida, but she was actually born in Alabama. But Zora kind of fudged facts all the time. She changed her age a lot as it kind of suited her, but you can still find her in some of the stories of the places that she wrote about in her stories in and around Florida. In Eatonville, as you come into town, she's on the grand entryway. They've got a bronze plaque of her. The top left painting is actually on a big basketball court that was done in the local community. And really the only building still standing is the Mosley House that she visited. But her home, the stores that she used to go to hear stories are long gone. But every year there's a huge Zora Neale Hurston Festival in late January in Eatonville that's really fun. A lot of online speakers as well that I highly recommend. She's well celebrated. Two of my favorite stories of hers come from when she spent time at a turpentining camp up in near Cross City at an area she called Shamrock. The only thing you can find now is a sign that says Shamrock, and I took my students there, and we all took our picture. I think there's like a Hardee's, yay, and a Western Auto. I mean, that was pretty much it. But she really talks about the difficulties of this industry and the poor people who really were economically enslaved, and even there were fences up around some of these camps. They could not leave, and got in debt to the company store and then never could leave. She also spends some time at a lumber mill camp in Polk County, where she actually lives in the quarters with the workers, parties with them, and she's busy writing down their songs, their tall tales, and tells some crazy accounts. One night, she's at a big party with the whole group in Polk County, and some woman decides that her husband or boyfriend is paying way too much attention to Hurston, threatens her with a knife, and she hauls out of there and drives to New Orleans. She's done with it. But it's really fascinating, and she really captures stories that I don't think anybody else could have done. She was a chameleon. She had graduated from Barnard College. She'd been part of the Harlem Renaissance, and yet she could just change right into a lumber mill worker, you know, and that enabled her to really gain some of her most wonderful stories. She's written multiple books. If you want to see some really good artifacts from Hurston, you need to go to Fort Pierce, Florida, where she spent the final years of her life. This is the graveyard where she has been buried. Alice Walker, the famous author who wrote The Color Purple, is the one who created the memorial at the graveyard and actually discovered it. And it was during a period when we were rediscovering Hurston in the 1980s. On the far right is the house where she lived near the end of her life. She taught at the local school. They were all segregated at the time, so she taught at the local school for high school for black students, and she was an English teacher there.
I think the U.S. Post Office dedicated its name to her.
They did, yes. So she's gotten a lot of recognition. What's happening in Fort Pierce right now is that they have created a Dust Tracks Trail. Dust Tracks is the name of one of her books, and you can go to many sites that she visited, including on the bottom right is the nursing home where she died, and they've gotten a big grant, and this year they hope to open a museum, and it will be dedicated to Hurston, and you can see where they did some mock-ups of what her room might have looked like in the nursing home, and they will also be celebrating the local black community, because not only did they have Hurston in Fort Pierce, they had the highwaymen, the artists. As a matter of fact, some of the highwaymen were students of hers at the high school and went to her funeral. So she was well recognized within the black community in Fort Pierce, but not so much outside by that period of time when she died. I'm going to wrap up with Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, who I'm a huge fan of, and I have to say right here, I'm on the board of trustees of the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings Society, so I've been reading her works for a very, very long time. She, in my opinion, she was the person who taught the rest of the country and even the world the beauty of rural Florida through her works. She and her husband had this great idea. Let's move to Florida, buy an orange grove, and then we can be full-time writers, and the orange groves will just pay for our lives, right? Well, it was in Micanopy, which is just south of Gainesville, and wasn't a great idea. And within 3 years, she had lost all of her inheritance and had spent her money, and she and her husband were not getting along, and so, but she had fallen in love with the area, and it had inspired her greatest works. This is the house that they bought together. This is the house very, very renovated. When they bought it, it had no paint on it, and it had a shingle roof that was falling apart. But as she gained money and fame in her writing, she was able to add on to the house. One of her most prideful things was when she finally put a flushing bathroom into the house instead of their outhouse. You can go visit this today. This is a state park. You can see this is the screened-in porch where they still keep her typewriter, and you can see that's where she used to write, and the neighbors said they could hear her typing away. And this is, and it's a wonderful trip. They have wonderful docents that can take you through it. This is at the University of Florida Archives. You can still see her original manuscripts for some of her books. This is the Yearling in 1939. It won the Pulitzer Prize. And you can see this is old school, right? You type on paper, you tape the pages together, you hand edit it. It's really fascinating. Rawlings had been a journalist, and she used those skills in writing her books. And although they may be works of fiction, she borrowed stories from lots and lots of her neighbors and acknowledges in the yearling that she borrowed bear hunts that she went out on or heard stories about. And the whole idea of a young boy who gets a yearling, right, as their pet came from hearing stories of old pioneers out there who talked about raising baby deer. And so, she was good. She had a good ear for dialect and was writing about who she met and what she saw. Oh, I should go back. Cross Creek on the far right is her semi-autobiographical book about her time in Cross Creek. It's totally out of order. And she never mentions her husband Charles, who left and they ended up divorced together. But one of my favorite chapters from the book is called Hyacinth Drift, in which she and her friend Desi decide they're going to take a trip on the St. Johns River, just the two women. Marjorie has got writer's block. Charles is about to leave her. She's totally depressed. Desi was a young woman who'd grown up in the area, and her idea of fun was to get outside, and the thing she'd always wanted to do was travel the length of the St. Johns River. So she talks, they have some moonshine one night, and the next morning, Desi says, Rawlings tried to back out of the deal they had made, and Desi said, too late, I've already got everything in motion, we're going. And so they do. Let's see. So they travel, and this is a chapter in Cross Creek, and it's something that has been near and dear to my heart. Ever since I had read that chapter, I tried to talk a girlfriend into taking the trip with me. It took several years, but I finally took a girlfriend with me. We wrote a magazine article about it, got so much response that years later, when I was involved with a nonprofit environmental documentary group, we decided to use that as the framework to explain to people the value of the St. Johns River. And the documentary was called In Marjorie's Wake. And as you can see, I ended up driving the boat because I owned the boat. I knew how to drive the boat, and they wanted two women to take this trip together. And I was accompanied by Jennifer Chase, who's a musician from Jacksonville, who wrote the whole music for the film as well. Jake Glisson, who was one of Rawlings's neighbors, drew us that painting describing them, and he knew Desi and Marjorie very well. So and after that happened, then I got a job as an adjunct professor at Rollins College, and after several years, decided to go back and get my PhD. I'm a very late life PhD, and so Rawlings has kind of been with me through this whole journey, I feel. And these are some of the stories from my book, Tracing Florida Journeys. At the end of every chapter, you'll see information about how to go back and see these sites if you're interested. My grandson recommends that you do that. And I really appreciate you all being here today. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions as well. Yes, ma'am.
I just started this book, but I absolutely love the vaster heart of Florida.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, it's so poetic, and the pictures are so gorgeous. I want to ask you about Jonathan Dickinson. I'm wondering if he was related to John Dickinson, who was the founder, one of the authors of, he was Constitution, signed the Constitution, and was... John Dickinson College was named for him.
I'm not sure. It could have been part of his family. They certainly were a wealthy family.
I went to Dickinson College, and that he was from the Philadelphia area. Dickinson is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, not far from Harrisburg.
I can't answer that, but I'm sure somebody has done that research for you. But he's an interesting guy, yeah.
So.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I noticed you started your journeys with Hernando de Soto, but Panfilo de Narvaez was here 10 years in Tampa Bay, 11 years before de Soto, and I was wondering why you didn't mention him and Cabeza de Vaca and their journey across the United States.
Well, they are in that chapter because Juan Ortiz, who was one of the people who was left behind who'd gone looking for them, becomes an important translator for the De Soto expedition. I used De Soto because there were so many accounts, so it was a pretty rich literary, treasure to jump into. But yes, there were earlier expeditions. And of course, we all know Ponce de Leon was really here for the Fountain of Youth, right? Not, but that's one of those things, tourist operators. But that's why, like I said, I had to stop somewhere. But thank you.
I have a question about Daniel Boone. You said he purchased land. Was that sight unseen? Did he ever physically step foot
Oh, no,
in
he was
Florida?
there. He was there. He bought some land, but when he got back home, he was with a group of people traveling around. When he got home, his wife said no.
Where was that land, and roughly what decade was it that he purchased the land?
Oh, well, I had a date up. Didn't I have a date? Let me see if we can find it. Off the top of my head, it was in the 1800s. Let's see if I can get back there. It was in the 1800s. It was very brief that he owned it. I'm sure he probably got sucked into some land deal and big ads for how wonderful it was. Wait a minute. Okay, sorry. So it was in the early 1800s, I believe, when he was there. There's a very short account of him being here, but I just was like, Daniel Boone. Oh, and Davy Crockett came too. He was with part of Jackson's expedition. So there were lots of names that I left out today.
And it was in Pensacola proper? That
It
he
was
purchased
in
the
that
land?
area. It was in the Panhandle area. Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
thanks. We're doing microphones.
Thank you. I was interested in your description of the Ingraham expedition, if you want to call it that. I'd call it more of a disaster going across the Everglades. I think that's the same Ingraham that was later hired by Henry Flagler to survey the line for the overseas highway.
It is the same.
And there's a highway in Miami, a road in Miami called Ingraham Highway.
It is, and it actually inspired the first state park in Florida. They were afraid that this road was going to run through this really important area that they called Paradise Key, and there were a lot of royal palms there, and they were afraid that this road was going to run through and ruin all of it. It had plants and orchids and all kinds of things, and it inspired the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs to create the first state park. Yeah.
But there was another pair of people that attempted another expedition going across the same basic route from Fort Myers to Miami. A few years after this, I think, but it was a photographer by the name of Julian Dimmick who had some really fantastic early photographs from about 1900 going across the Everglades and encountering Seminole villages and so forth. And it's an interesting read because it's not just the photographs, it's the narrative that goes with it.
Thank you. There had also been an expedition prior to Ingraham that the New Orleans Times-Picayune had paid for, seeing this as this grand story. And they had come back and said, yeah, don't do this. This is terrible. No one should be traveling here. It should never be settled. But no one paid attention to that story when they set off. Yeah, thank you. I think, did you have a question? Oh, this lady right here too.
There is part of the national park system in Bradenton dedicated to DeSoto. So what you're saying is he never landed in DeSoto?
No, and the Park Service will actually tell you, we know this isn't the real site. But there was, and this is in my chapter, there was this big boosterism in Bradenton, and since we don't have like George Washington stayed here, DeSoto kind of becomes the go-to guy that if you're trying to promote history. And so there were a bunch of boosters down in the Bradenton area who wanted to claim him, and people in Punta Gorda also claim him. Charlotte Harbor also claims him, and but they got the money and they got a piece of land donated, and they got the National Park Service to come build. There's a DeSoto site there. And they will tell you that's not the right place, and there's been a whole history written of just about that. But but let me just say, it's still a great place to go. They do a great interpretation. They have some great films, but they know they're not. I know. It's just kind of, and there was no Jose Gaspar too. You know that, right? What? I know. But nevertheless, Bradenton and Sarasota have huge DeSoto days, parties every year. And I mean, it's just kind of this kind of Florida tourism thing. Yeah, kind of crazy. Yes, sir.
On two things. As to James Ingraham, there's a street in Port Tampa named after him.
Is there?
If you drive down there, you can find it just south of Interbay Boulevard, and there's some homes that are still there that Henry Plant built because that was his company town, and it was the part of embarkation for the Peninsula and Occidental shipping line, and also for his steamship lines. On DeSoto, there's also a narrative that he sent a landing party to Longboat Key. That before he came around to Piney Point, he anchored off Longboat Key and dispatched a landing party that came ashore at Longboat Key and found that was not enough land there, and they got back on. Years later, they believed that the small boat that they had used to come off of the caravel, the Spanish caravel, was found at an end of a street that goes into Sarasota Bay. If you go down to Longboat Key and look for a street called Juan Añasco, Juan Añasco was a scout that DeSoto had dispatched to go on to Longboat Key, and they believe the ruins of his boat were found at the end of that street in modern times.
Yeah.
And they named the street in his honor. So there's another theory, but that was not a landing party. That was a scouting party.
Just a scouting.
You're correct. Piney Point. Well, we think you're correct. I mean, Piney Point was where they probably all came ashore, and followed basically what became Highway 301.
I agree. Wouldn't he have appreciated 301 now? I mean, it's so much easier, because there were no bridges over these rivers, and they had storms. And some of the scouting parties on land they sent out got really close to Orlando. They went that far to the east, but they were mostly looking for food, because the Tampa Bay area natives didn't really have a big agricultural tradition because they didn't have to. They had all this shellfish and fish and deer and plenty of food to eat. But so that makes it really interesting too to see how I can't figure out how they found each other again after they wandered off and came back, and they were up and down the coast multiple times. So it's and there are probably locations that could be completely verified where DeSoto landed, but we haven't explored everything. There's so many mounds that got torn down for road construction or house construction now. So it's still a huge mystery. People still debate it to this day.
If you ever want to take a quick trip to Jacksonville, go from Tampa to Jacksonville on 301. There's no traffic. And at the Hillsborough River State Park entrance, there's a DeSoto marker.
Is there?
Now, whether it's true or not, they say he came through there.
The Bartram markers, the only requirement is that they're within 50 miles of where Bartram traveled. And there's one in downtown Winter Park. He was never there, but I don't mind because it teaches people who Bartram was and gets them interested. But yeah, so there is a whole DeSoto trail too. Yeah, thank you. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you so much for coming today. As part of your being here, I really hope that you'll take a look at the Humanities Council table, and also I think I have a QR code if you want to. There we go. If you want some more information about the Humanities Council, or if you would like to answer a survey about the program today. I hope you've had fun. I've had fun. I could tell these stories on and on and on. So thank you so much for coming. Take care.